Ready, set.
All right, I will set us up to go live, and we're live.
Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to today's program, Sexual Harassment and Its Implications, sponsored by the Tompkins County Office of Human Rights. Thanks for taking time today to join us. I'm Ken Clarke, Director of the Office of Human Rights. With us today as panelists are Heather Campbell, Executive Director of the Advocacy Center of Tompkins County, Omar Stout, Title IX Deputy Coordinator at Ithaca College, and Leslie Moskowitz, Manager of Organizational Development for the City of Ithaca. I look forward to the insights they will share with us, as well as questions and comments from you, the audience. In the fall of 1982, as a divinity school student, I was in a class in which the feminist theologian Marjorie Sahaki gave a comprehensive analysis of the ripple effect of sexual misconduct in a community. From a feminist perspective, she said the impact of such behavior is not only directly experienced by the victim, it also impacts multiple persons and institutions of an entire community. Someone has been hurt. A betrayal of community has occurred. Trust has been broken. Professor Sahaki's theory emphasized the sacredness of human life, that all human beings had dignity and worth and should be treated as such, and that humans were created to live in a relational, interdependent, contextual world. She echoed Martin Luther King Jr.'s assertion that all life is interrelated. He said we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Therefore, sexual harassment, sometimes the precursor to sexual assault, and its impact never occurs in a vacuum. Actions always have implications. Today's discussion of sexual assault and its implications occurs in the context of the Me Too movement, founded over a decade ago by the African-American feminist Tarana Burke. Me Too centers on the focus on survivors, particularly Black and other women of color whose stories of abuse are so often obscured in public discussion. Me Too demands accountability for sexual harassers and the dismantling of systems that perpetuate not only sexual violence, but also the abuses of power and privilege that preserve sexism and racism. We also undertake this discussion in the aftermath of the murder of 8 people, 6 of them of Asian Pacific Islander descent, in spas owned by API citizens in Atlanta last week. These murders are part of the rising tide of harassment and violent assaults against Asian Pacific Islanders, attributed in considerable measure to racist public commentary related to COVID-19. The Atlanta tragedy is reminiscent of a long history of discrimination and violence toward Asian and Pacific Islanders, and the exoticizing and over-sexualization of Asian Pacific Island women. This is the context of today's conversation, which will begin with comments by Heather Campbell.
And I'm muted, so that we've had the ubiquitous Zoom moment to start us out. Thank you, Dr. Clarke, for your comments. And I really appreciate the way that you framed this, because I think it's really important that we're considering, when we're talking about sexual harassment, we're considering this as part of the spectrum of sexual violence that disproportionately impacts women, and that also impacts those most vulnerable in our community the most. And so I so appreciate you for framing our conversation that way today. I am Heather Campbell. I'm the Executive Director of the Advocacy Center. For those of you who are less familiar with our agency, we're the nonprofit in Tompkins County that's providing support services and prevention education on issues of domestic and sexual violence, which includes sexual harassment. So we have a 24-hour hotline. We provide we have advocates who provide one-on-one support to people who've experienced forms of sexual or domestic forms of harassment or violence. Our services are free, available 24 hours a day. And we also do a lot of training and prevention around these issues in our community, working with youth, college students, community members, and also in workplaces. And we do a fair amount of training on sexual harassment as well. My experience started in this work as an advocate. So I worked with survivors of sexual harassment, and then I spent 13 years as an educator and a trainer. So I did a lot of trainings in workplaces, working with staff, working with supervisors and leaders to work on how we can create a culture where sexual harassment is less likely, and a culture and an environment where sexual harassment occurs, that there's appropriate intervention and protection of the people who have been harmed, and accountability for the people who are doing that harm. And so that's the framework where I'm coming from. When we got together to talk about this panel, there were so many things that we could talk about in a very limited amount of time. So I'm going to try to help us continue to frame this conversation, and then Leslie and Omar are going to talk in more specifics about some intervention policy and prevention areas that their work really connects with. I do also want to say this is not a training on sexual harassment, on how to intervene, on how to prevent, or how to respond. There's great training resources out there. If you want links to those things, we can probably get them out to you, because there's lots of resources in our community and out. But before we start, I do want to just quickly, to make sure we're all talking about the same thing, define when we say sexual harassment, what do we mean? And so sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination. It is unlawful under federal and state laws. And it includes unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature, and that's directed at a person because of the individual's sex. And such conduct has the effect of unreasonably interfering with an individual's work performance, or creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. And when we're talking about sexual harassment, we're often talking about two different forms of sexual harassment, although there's definite overlap. Quid pro quo, where someone is penalized, or put in a situation where they're being asked to perform or be exposed to something of sexual nature, and that there are negative consequences to their job for refusing to do that. Or hostile work environment, where the sexual comments or conduct or behaviors are creating an environment that is hostile to that person or that class of people. So that's when we're talking about sexual harassment, those are the range of behaviors that we're considering. Sexual harassment is incredibly pervasive, unfortunately, and it's incredibly pervasive for women and female identified people in the workplace. A recent study, and this has been replicated again and again, is that over 80% of women and 43% of men experience some form of sexual harassment in their work life. So this is incredibly pervasive. A really recent study, actually this came across a study last week, a study of female wait staff, so people who are waitressing, waiting tables. 90% reported repeated instances of sexual harassment in the previous 30 days of work. People in the service industry, people working in the service industry are particularly vulnerable, particularly those who worked in tipped environments are particularly vulnerable to sexual harassment. We are focusing today mostly on the experiences of women in sexual harassment. March is Women's History Month. That's one of the things that brought us together today. And we want to recognize that female identified people are disproportionately impacted by sexual harassment and sexual assault. But people of all gender identities experience sexual harassment. And that is really important for us to have that awareness, and also make sure that's part of our workplace awareness as well. I also want to note that LGBTQ identified people are maybe particularly targeted by sexual harassment, and in some jurisdictions in some states may also have fewer legal protections in recourse. Sexual harassment can have a tremendous impact on the lives of people who experience it. It really can impact, and often does in my experience of working with survivors, it impacts victims of sexual harassment very globally in their life. It's been really well documented that sexual harassment has a negative impact on people's physical and emotional health, that it impacts productivity in the workplace, that there's a financial impact both for victims of sexual harassment who may have to leave jobs or lose opportunities for training or for education or for promotion at work. It impacts people's career development. It impacts hiring retention in the workplace as well. So there's a workplace argument and a business argument for preventing sexual harassment as well. And I really appreciate the framework that Dr. Clarke put out in the beginning of recognizing that when there is sexual harassment, there is harm done. And I think we have to really recognize that there is harm done to people, and that there has been trust that has been broken. And I think that framework is very true and very important for us to recognize. Sexual harassment is incredibly pervasive and incredibly underreported still. Even with the increased focus over the last 20 to 30 years, it is still incredibly underreported. And also many victims of sexual harassment have the experience that they may report or tell others and then find their experiences minimized. They may hear themselves blamed, or they may see no effective action taken to protect them or hold that person doing harm accountable. In many cases, also in cases that I've been involved in cases that are often reported in the media, there may be other coworkers or supervisors who have also seen or witnessed the behavior or had it reported to them and who have also minimized that behavior. And so really reinforcing that this isn't also just a burden that is placed on the person who's the direct target of the harassment, but it's a responsibility for everyone in the workplace, that we're making sure the workplace is safe and equitable for everyone, and we all have a role in that. One of the things I wanted to talk about today is the vulnerability that we require of survivors, that we almost sort of seem to require and do require of survivors in order to receive help, support, and safety. In order to report sexual harassment and receive workplace protections, we're really requiring women to make themselves and their careers and their livelihoods vulnerable. This is an even bigger ask for women who have less privilege in the workplace, whether that is because of their education level, their race or ethnicity, immigration status, financial stability, or job security, meaning how disposable they're seen by their employers and how easily replaced they're seen by their employers. And there are risks for survivors. And the bigger the power differential between the person doing the harm and the person who's being harmed, the bigger the risk can be for survivors. And I also really appreciated that Dr. Clarke brought up the Me Too movement, because in the Me Too movement, we've been talking about this a lot in our office, there can almost start to be an expectation for victims of sexual violence. And, again, sexual violence or sexual harassment is part of that spectrum of sexual violence, as Dr. Clarke referenced in the beginning. But there almost becomes this feeling of expectation for victims to speak up and tell their stories and to tell their stories publicly. And the stories that we're often hearing publicly, I want to recognize, are the stories of the people who often have a fair amount of privilege, because there are risks that survivors face in telling their stories, whether it's reporting it or it becoming more public, for example, in the media. And there are real risks that victims face. And, one of the things I've heard Tarana Burke, the founder of the Me Too movement, speak in person. And it's a really, if you have that opportunity to either see her online or hear her speak in person, I really recommend it. But one of the things she really talks about is the public nature of the Me Too movement was not what she founded. She founded the Me Too movement really as a way for survivors to say to each other, I see your pain and you see mine. And I think it's really important that we're creating spaces for survivors, for their pain and that harm to be recognized. We also want to make sure we're not putting pressure on survivors to tell their stories in ways that can create further risk for them. And if they are telling their stories in ways or reporting in ways that are creating risk for them, we're doing everything we can to protect them and to support them and to support their livelihood and their ability to make a living, and as well as their physical and emotional health. And this is why, prevention and intervention is so important. And I know Leslie and Omar are both going to talk about that more. One last thing I wanted to say is when New York State 2 years ago passed a law requiring more robust sexual harassment policies and training in the workplace. And our agency during that implementation time received a lot of very worried and in some cases panicked phone calls from employers and supervisors. Excuse me. These are workplaces that had basic policies in place, had maybe even done some very basic, training about sexual harassment. But when needing to have more robust and more detailed and more nuanced conversations about sexual harassment in the workplace, they really found themselves to be unequipped. And people were often not prepared or equipped to hear the stories of sexual harassment that they heard from their employees. That once we opened the door and provided people with more space and safer ways to talk about and report this, employers were often not prepared for what they heard. I think we need to be comfortable acknowledging and talking about sexual harassment as sexualized power. That's what it is. Sexual harassment is power that has been sexualized. And we need to be more comfortable identifying and talking about power in the workplace and how it can be used to create vulnerability. And we need to be more comfortable being active bystanders, meaning that, again, that shared responsibility that we all have. And as supervisors and leaders in organizations, we need to recognize that we are bystanders with a lot of power, the power to shape policy, the power to shape culture, and the power to create a culture in an organization where this kind of abuse of power is less likely to happen. And this is going to make all of our workplaces safer for everyone. I'm going to hand it over to Leslie, I believe, correct?
Omar.
Oh, Omar, I'm sorry. Handing it to Omar next.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Dr. Clarke, for opening up and really providing some great context for our conversation today. My name is Omar Stout. I'm the Title IX deputy at Ithaca. So I want to be upfront to just for us all to be on the same page. Title IX is a federal law put in place in 1972 that says students and people should be able to participate in their education free from discrimination. It also applies to the employees of those institutions. So while we're here to talk about sexual harassment, I'm going to just expand it a little bit to talk about sexual misconduct as a wide array of behaviors and potential attitudes that lend themselves to the harassment and discrimination that might prevent someone from engaging in their education. I view my role as preparing students for their next steps. So as they engage in the community, as they engage in the workforce, they're empowered to be knowledgeable about the rights and resources afforded to them as community members, as employees, and also empowered to recognize the cultural attitudes that lend themselves to harassment behavior. Right. So at Ithaca College, I lead the prevention efforts on campus. And in that role, I work with colleagues across campus to host programs that build awareness on what misconduct looks like and the options available to respond to misconduct, sexual misconduct. And that starts at the entry point to the college. For students, that's like first year programs and orientations. For employees, excuse me, that's the college's onboarding process. And this initial context is important because it helps us to establish that culture that we do not tolerate sexual violence or misconduct on campus. But because, as has been stated, sexual violence and misconduct is so prevalent in our society, the prevention work can't end there, right? So throughout the year, we offer programming on consent, bystander intervention, how to make a report of sexual misconduct and what to expect when a report is made, how to support a friend involved in the process, how to recognize the signs of sex and gender-based violence, right? And how to keep those tools with you as you navigate, as you matriculate through the college and enter society as a community member, as an employee. Even with all that programming, we can't forget that prevention is a community-based effort. And I'd like to remind everyone in the audience today about the role that you can play in prevention work on a daily basis. In your sphere of influence, professionally and personally, what steps are you taking to break the cultural norms that play into rape culture, that play into narratives of victim blaming and the hypersexualization of identities like men, like women of color, people who identify as LGBT. These are things we can do every day that can make the world a safer place. And sometimes it's as straightforward as making sure your colleagues know who the resources are, making sure our kids know that anyone can be in the receiving end of sexual harassment, right? And refuting the narratives that we commonly see in media that contribute to the hypersexualization of populations like the ones I've just mentioned. The hypersexualization, right, leads to a barrier of reporting where we know people who identify as men, LGBT, people of color, experience sexual violence in much higher rates than they are statistically shown to report it, right? So something we can all do is think about how we conceptualize dating violence and how we communicate that throughout our sphere of influence. I encourage you today to think about your language. Make sure you're respecting people's pronouns and chosen names. Right? Statistics will show that just respecting people's pronouns and respecting the chosen names can contribute to making everyone feel happier, right? It can lower the rates of suicide and depression in those populations. All right. And think about how you respond to narratives of sexual violence and discrimination in the media every day. right? This is an ongoing conversation, right? And like Heather said, this isn't a training, this isn't a workshop, right? But it's an opportunity to engage in this conversation, right? And at Ithaca College, we seek to spread knowledge about bystander intervention and empower community members to play an active role in changing the culture that exists around sexual misconduct every day. And as I wrap up, I'd be remiss if I just didn't lay it all out for you, right? In New York, we have enough is enough, right? Article 129B, which has provided students with a Bill of Rights, letting them know what they should expect to experience when making a report of sexual violence. So if you are a student going to college in New York State, or you know a student, let them know about the Bill of Rights. Empower them to be knowledgeable about the rights afforded to them. If you work at a higher education institution, know that Title IX applies to you and offer your resources and offers you resources and services. Get in contact with your Title IX coordinator to learn more. Know that when a report of sexual misconduct is made to the college, the person making that report is provided with the options and resources and empowered to make their own decisions. If someone wants to engage in the formal process, they will experience a fair, impartial, and thorough investigation. And that will be reviewed by a conduct process to determine the most appropriate response to the allegations brought forward. You know, our goal of the college is to prepare our students to enter a workforce and contribute toward a culture that does not enable sexual harassment, sexual violence, sexual misconduct, right? And we do that by, they can do that by being able to recognize sex and gender-based discrimination, understand the ways in which they can safely intervene, and by being familiar with what it might be like to make a report to an authority, whether that be human resources or even law enforcement. My personal goal is to decentralize this work, right? This, what we're talking about, is a public health issue, right? So it's on all of us. It takes all of us to make a safe and inclusive work environment. As a professional, I believe the more we empower students to make reports and educate the community as a whole on what sexual harassment is and how they can dismantle the cultural norms, the better prepared they are for life beyond college. As an example, it's as an example I've already given, it's the little things we can do, right? To break down the norms that play into sexual violence, as I've said before. So I'll stop talking now. I hope there are questions for me later on. I'm handing it over to Leslie. Thank you.
So I wanted to unmute myself, and Dr. Clarke, Heather, Omar, thank you for setting me up. There definitely will be some common threads as I proceed. So I'm Leslie Moskowitz. I'm the Manager of Organizational Development for the City of Ithaca. And in regards to today's topic, at the city, I'm responsible for communicating the city's sexual harassment policy and for providing the training to our staff, supervisors, and anyone who interacts regularly with the city. That is my role. But however, I understand that to tackle sexual harassment, that training is just one part of the bigger strategy. So we've had a policy and training in place since 2001. But in 2018, when New York State came out with their sexual harassment legislation, we updated our documents and our training, and there was a much larger emphasis placed on gender harassment that we included in our training at that time. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the city, the departments a little bit. We have like 12 departments, and we have public safety, Department of Public Works, youth and senior services, support departments. And having said that, we hire people with many different kinds of backgrounds, different cultures, coming from lots of different geographical areas. And they come with a history and different experiences. So I'll talk a little bit about that when we have our training. So our goal is to ensure that employees can be productive, that they feel respected in the work environment, and that they feel safe to report issues. And then I'm going to emphasize that again too, because if you watch the media, a lot of people don't come forward to talk about an issue because of the potential or actual consequences that they might have. So that is one of our goals. So our training includes, I'll say, the traditional, New York State requirements. Heather set us up a little bit about quid pro quo and hostile environment. I do want to add that we try to, we want to address knowledge, but we also want to try to address attitudes too about this subject, because that's so important. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of some of the things that we emphasize in the training. And right up front, we do organizational values and expectations, because we want everybody to be on the same page. Everybody does not have the same common sense. So we do share our expectations, and we're very explicit about what that is. It's kind of interesting because, most of the people that work, all the people for the city are good people, I'm going to say. But sometimes in conversations, it'll come up is, can we really control their free speech? And what we try to explain to them is that when you have policies and procedures and values in place, that overrides sort of like the free speech when you're out just hanging around with your friends or other people. We also start off with an exercise about what respect looks like. And the goal of that is to have people feel what it might be like in somebody else's shoes. It's very easy to talk about how it is when you're disrespected. We can make that laundry list right up. And some of the comments from the training will be, people have to think about it a little bit, but they say, well, people will ask my opinion, or I'll be included in conversations, or they'll even just say good morning. So we're trying to set up the environment in this training. Our goal too is for employees to be ambassadors and to self-monitor. Of course, we have expectations for our supervisors, but that's such a different type of dynamic if you have the supervisors always bringing down the hammer versus employees who desire to have this respectful environment and establish a certain kind of culture. And we talk a lot, I think Omar talked about language and words. We bring up the point, do we unconsciously condone behavior through our actions and words? Think about how men, women, and the LGBTQ, how they're portrayed in images and in articles. Are there these stereotypes, the jokes? For instance, or they always appear as like victims instead of being in a power position. Some of the commercials, I think, on TV, when you talk about women, how come they're always getting explained to, or they're the ones that are always cooking? This kind of normalizes certain kinds of behaviors for the different genders. We talk about, employees will say, well, I didn't mean anything by it. I was just joking around. I don't know why they were kind of like sensitive or they got offended by that. And so we have some deep conversations about impact, and that's what is important. You might not have intended to offend somebody, but it did. And for some people, this might cause depression or isolation or even trauma. There's a neurobiology to sexual assaults and sexual harassment, and it involves our hormones, our brain, our gut, which are all tied into our memories, our physical self, and emotions. And I think Heather brought out some of that point. So there's science behind it. So a respectful environment, I'm not done yet, but a respectful environment in an organization, we have to walk the talk, or else the real message is delivered. So I just want to give you an example. If you're in a meeting, I will say to people, to the audience out there, see who's getting interrupted. See who's getting called on. See who gets praise. See who gets comments like, oh, you seem to have a lot of concerns. And that tells you a lot about your culture and dynamics. It's sort of like a litmus test, or you can get a pulse on the organization. So what I want to go into now is a little bit about maybe some things that the employees will say. They they might feel, not everybody, but they might feel like, well, if somebody's bothered about it, why don't they just tell me? Well, it's complicated because some people are introverts. Maybe some people have had bad experiences about bringing it up before. It might even be cultural, that it's not appropriate to be, like very assertive. And an organization promises that the environment will be respectful and safe. So it's the onus is on us to behave appropriately, not for someone else to bring it up. Departments have shared, or people have shared, I'll say maybe even in other work environments, how destructive it's been when there's been a sexual harassment complaint, that there might be like team A and team B, supporting the perpetrator or the victim, and that it really destroys trust in the whole department team. Employees also, like, they're afraid that maybe, are we getting to be too, what I call, sterile? Geez, I have to watch everything I have to say. These are some of the comments. Some of that might be fear. Some of that might be like resistance. It's sort of like the first reaction when you're talking about change. And by the way, if it feels difficult, that means that change is really happening. I mean, if it seems too easy, maybe it's not really hit and pay dirt. But I always like to give the example about the sterile environment. You can have comedians that are really trashy, right? And get their laughs. And you can have comedians that are sort of PG rated and still get laughs. Because if you're building relationships in an organization, it's not going to be like that sterile environment. It'll be respectful and still collaborative. Let me see. So what's my observations over time? I've been teaching and training for over 20 years. And I have noticed that the generations have their responses and expectations from different generations are different. And I think it goes back to, again, what was normalized during certain generations, but just are not accepted anymore. And ever since the Me Too explosion, it's been around for a decade, but in 2017, Heather brought out, people of privilege brought up about how they've been affected and impacted with sexual harassment. The conversations in the training have become more frank, and it's not like a little dirty secret anymore. I think a key to, in at least a workplace organization, is, of course, the culture set, but it comes from the top. Executive and supervisors are key to this, because you need those fingers throughout the organization to set the tone. Unfortunately, sexual harassment still is pervasive and exists, but there's more societal consequences now. So I'm hoping it's going to weed some of this out. And I'm going to end with that this is a very complex issue. Relationship building, structure, discussion, and services all play a part.
Thank you all, Heather, Omar, and Leslie, for your comments. And we already have a question in the chat that has come to me. And the question, or it's a statement and a question. Men are usually perpetrators of sexual harassment and assault. How frequently are women caught up in an inappropriate contact with employees? And is it handled the same way as it is handled with men?
Well, I can jump in by saying yes. So, I mean, power can be used in the workplace by both men and women. So women may sexually harass other people in the workplace. Statistically, it doesn't happen as often. And there's all kinds of cultural reasons, we think, for why that is. But yes, it absolutely does happen. And the laws around sexual harassment and sexual assault are gender neutral. So I would say, a good investigation should always happen when there's a report of sexual harassment, regardless of what assumptions we may have about the relative power of that person. So we should do, and this is where I think, Omar and has experience on the academic realm about, those kinds of good procedures. But yeah, I think it's important that we're always following those procedures, and that we're always making sure that the workplace is safe for everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. I just add that the laws that I quoted, Title IX, enough is enough, are pretty clear in that they prescribe a fair, equitable, and impartial investigation and conduct process, regardless of identity or expression, right? Mm-hmm. So that's going to be the same and consistent, regardless of how either they're reporting party or responding party, whatever the identities they ascribe to.
And I would just like to add that individuals who do investigations are trained so that they can be impartial. I mean, it takes a little bit of training.
Mm-hmm. And this is where, I think particularly for organizations that don't have their own HR resources, for smaller organizations, I really, I often, when people may call with me to consult about a situation or say, we just had a report, we're not quite sure what to do. This is where an employment attorney or outside help or outside HR consulting, for organizations that don't have an internal experience with doing investigations or don't have those internal knowledge base of how to do that, this is where I really encourage organizations to reach out to HR consultants, to legal assistants, to make sure that they're following all the steps they need to protect their employees and to do a good and thorough and equitable investigation. And those resources are out there in our community.
Well, great, thanks for your responses. Another question is, how does race influence sexual harassment cases, especially if it's Black men accused of inappropriate contact with white women?
Well, I mean, sexual harassment happens in the context of culture, right? And this is where, I think our awareness of intersectionality and how race and gender intersect. And so I think it goes back to, again, good internal policies and investigations, and recognizing, and I think having to make sure that people who are doing investigations are considering the full picture of what's happening and the context. The full picture of what's happening is not actually what I meant to say, but considering. Well, I think context is matter, because it really is looking at what is the intent and impact. And what is the intent and impact for both the person who is making the report and the person who is alleged to have done the harm. And I think we can't ignore race. We shouldn't ignore race and the impact of racist attitudes and policies and laws in our country. We can't, because that's a part of the conversation.
I'm repeating what Heather said, but I'll just make the statement is that it's totally intertwined. And that I had a thought there that's went away I know, we can't compartmentalize this. It's not about race. It's not just about sexual harassment. It's not about just like gender. All those have to be, all those integrations have to be considered. So I think, Heather, that you captured that, but it's not compartmentalized at all.
I'd just like to add, I think it's a little bit of everything. I think we have to do a good job of, the prevention work, right out of the gate. As we've said before, there are populations of individuals who experience sexual misconduct at much higher rates, right? So getting out to them, make sure that they're knowledgeable about the process, they're aware of the rights and resources afforded to them. And then I'm going to hark on what Heather said about the policies and procedures and the investigation, right? I think having those in place and following those processes without bias intertwined, that's the best way we can do it, right? Your race should not dictate whether or not you are responsible for an action, right? The evidence is going to the preponderance of evidence is the rule of thumb we abide by at Ithaca College, and so the evidence that stacks up to that specific action that is cited in the allegation, that's what we're looking into.
Can each of you address a little bit further how to create a culture in which sexual harassment is reduced? I mean, ideally, in an ideal world, we'd eliminate it completely. We know we don't live in an ideal world. But how is a culture created in environments, social, cultural, workplace, and otherwise, where we shift the culture?
Building on something that Leslie said, I do want to say, I think that Me Too has changed our conversations, our public conversations about sexual harassment and sexual violence in particular. And I think we are having more frank and direct conversations. And I think that also we have created more space for hearing survivors' stories and hearing and believing survivors' stories. So I do think there has been a change, and I think that change is for the better. We're just talking about it more. One of the things when I was thinking about this panel, one of the things I thought about as well were the calls that I get from supervisors or leaders sometimes, where they call me about a situation where they feel it's kind of borderline. They feel like the behavior is not appropriate. But what they sometimes say to me is, well, it's not quite sexual harassment yet. It hasn't hit the level of a policy violation. And so I'm not sure what to do. And what I find is often sometimes leaders and supervisors almost feel like their hands are tied if it hasn't quote unquote gotten bad enough or risen to that level. And one of the things I really encourage people to is to intervene and say something, speak up, address things at a much lower level and to not wait. So if you are hearing comments, hearing joking, seeing someone on your team or in your workplace targeted in a way that is about their gender or gender presentation, and that is potentially having a negative impact on them or on other people who are seeing it, even if it's not negatively impacting that direct person, that you speak up and address that behavior, that you're not without power. And I think that's that culture piece, is that we want to create a culture of safety and a culture of inclusion, and not feel like our hands are tied if it hasn't crossed a policy, some kind of policy line where we're required to take action. Because by that point, the harm has been done. And the situation is often more complicated and more complex. And so I really encourage people to identify those what might be considered sort of lower threshold behaviors, and think about, is that part of the culture that you want to have? And if not, have direct conversations about that.
Are you going, Omar? You look like you were moving, but
Go ahead.
yeah. So I'm just thinking a little bit, because I don't want to, what's another word for complex? But, culture will take a life of its own if you don't set some structures in place. That's what kind of happens in, I'll say, the mini environments, right, in our organizations. What's not said is okay, right? So part of it is your policies and procedures and your educations and trainings. The structures help. But then, of course, it's a combination of your people with that. So your leaders, and I'll say your influencers too, because you have informal leaders that people follow. And even just the environment. So collaboration, having your employees involved in not the decision-making, but the setting up of what this will look like. I can't give you the how-to right now, but I would say that it has elements of those kinds of things. And I know, Omar, it seemed like you were setting up culture and structure with when you were describing your environment there at Ithaca College.
Yeah, thank you. I was gonna give you some kudos. I think you said it best, right? It's no longer this dirty little secret, right? So let's talk about it, right? We know it exists, we know it's prevalent, and we know it's a problem, right? And so now we're getting to a place where we can start identifying the attitudes and the norms that contribute to those behaviors, right? And as Heather said, let's address them early on before they rise to the level of a policy violation or breaking a law, right? So I like to think of it as an iceberg, right? And we pay attention to the tip of the iceberg, which are some of the most egregious and heinous behaviors, right? That's what makes the news. That's what stays with us the longest. But, the comments that are made, right? The microaggressions that are directed, right? Those are the things that happen every single day that make it okay, right, for certain behaviors to happen. And at the college, we have the ability to address, behaviors that aren't a violation of law, but are a violation of policy, right? But when you get into, the community, it might not be that way, right? So we encourage people to start early and often, as Heather has said, and to continue that on, right? It's going to take all of us to break this culture and to replace those norms that contribute to sexual violence with norms that contribute to equity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question has come to us is, as professionals working through these issues, how do you check your own racial and gender biases that come into play when you are working with victims and perpetrators? What strategies do you use?
Well, I'll just jump in a little. I think you have to be very self-aware of what your biases are. I'm not going to say I'm 100% aware, but one of the, at least at the training level here, when we're doing like interviewing training, we have a discussion about that. And one of the tools that we use is the Harvard bias test. Just because it makes people aware that, oh yeah, I do have I do have biases, because most people, like I said, will say they feel like they're good people, and research has shown that we all have biases. So you just have to be first aware of it. And what I tell people, or I shouldn't say tell, I'm sorry, I'm from Brooklyn, so I come off with that language sometimes. What I have people think about is, if you have a reaction, don't say anything, sit back and try to analyze why you're having a reaction. It might be from past experience, or maybe the norm that you grew up in. So that's one of my tips. Is we do a little bit of training and education here at the city. And then the first thing is being even aware what some of yours might be, and that there's some tools out there.
Yeah, I think like a fish doesn't know it's wet, right? Like we're all swimming in our stuff, right? And we all have it. And it's in the soup that we're existing in. And I think the thing is not pretending that we don't have those things, because we all do, and that it's being aware of them, right? As aware as you can be. And this is where this intersects. We can't do sexual harassment work in a vacuum. This really intersects with equity and inclusion work in our workplaces as well. This is very intertwined, and I think it doesn't do anyone or workplaces any good to try to decouple these as if it's not all part of the fabric. And I also think this is when I'm thinking of I think a good process as well is going to have some checks and balances, right? Where there's not just one set of eyeballs who is a final determiner on this, because sometimes we don't know what we don't know, right? And we're not, we don't know what we're not seeing sometimes until there's somebody else and I think also putting those checks into the process of, are there assumptions that we're not seeing here that we should be taking into account? So this is where I think having some checks and balances around equity is important in the process as well.
In working with victims, what does the road toward restoration look like?
Well, that's a big question. Yeah. I don't know. I think a lot. I don't know. I feel like the longer I work with survivors of sexual and domestic violence, I think the question of what justice or being made whole looks like means so many different things to different people. So I think that there is a question there. And I think we can talk in generalities, right? People should have the right to be safe and to be able to support themselves and their families. There are these, basic, what I would consider sort of basic human rights that we all have. But I think there is a question, that's a really important conversation, I think, to have with someone who has been harmed, is what would make you whole? And what does justice look like for you? What are you hoping? What if you had the magic wand, what would you hope would happen on the other side of this? You might be surprised by that answer, because for some people that may be a very concrete thing. I want to know that I'm not going to lose my job. Right? I want to know that I don't have to interact with this person on a daily basis anymore. And I don't have to have that pit in my stomach every time I go into a meeting, this person is going to be there. It may be, I want to know that the financial harm that I experienced is going to be made whole. So there really could be, and some of those things we may be able to make happen for people, and some of them we may not be able to. But I think it's a really important conversation for us to have, both individually, but then also, larger. I think it's a really important cultural question right now as well.
Yeah, and I was going to add, if I go to a more global thing, is that the language changes, that when you see articles that the power plays aren't there, like one person's in the power position and the other one always looks like the victim. If we're talking about even the it's equitable with economic opportunities, that it's not, the sexism and whatever doesn't come in there. So there'll be big structural changes on the global level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to note something that Heather said earlier, like this is a sexualized power, which thank you for that. I'm going to be using that. I get the rights to it. But that's something that we try to engage in at IC, is giving that power back to the impacted party any way we can, right? And we remind individuals when they come to us that working with us doesn't mean that we're just going to throw you into an investigation if that's not what you want, right? More often than not, 99.9% of the time, we're going to be able to just do exactly what you want. And we call that supporting your healing. If supporting your healing means an investigation, we are happy to go through that process with you and educate you on what that's going to look like. If that just means what you need right now is connection with some counseling or help changing a classroom, whatever it is, and we really let that student, faculty, staff member, whoever it is, dictate that process, put them in the driver's seat, as I like to say, and let them tell us where we're going.
Another related question to the last one is how to encourage the most vulnerable in the population, wait staff, for example, who are vulnerable to being being propositioned, but also are economically vulnerable as well. How to encourage them to report, to take the risk of reporting? Based on your experience.
Yeah, well, the one thing I would say is I'm actually not a big fan of the tipped economy for exactly this reason. Is I actually think the tip economy, where people, and often the most lowest paid folks are depending on tips and the kindness of strangers in order to survive, I think really creates a power differential that actually leads to more harassment. So that's my I have a soapbox moment about the tip economy that I find myself feeling stronger and stronger about. One of the things I think for people knowing where they can get support outside of their workplace if they want to talk this through with somebody else. So whether that is a place like the Worker Center, who I know talks to a lot of people in Tompkins County about sexual harassment. It's a place like our agency where people can call confidentially. If there's an EAP program at your workplace that you can access. So knowing at the college, of course, there are some confidential people that you can reach out to in that environment. So I think for people to know that, because sometimes people just want to talk it through without having to make a formal report, and knowing and help weigh the pros and cons. I'm also a huge fan of multiple avenues for reporting. I get worried when there's only one path for reporting. So you have to go to this owner or this supervisor or this one HR person. So I think the more paths we can give people, and the more options, but also really recognizing that there's real economic insecurity sort of baked in to our capitalist environment that does make folks really vulnerable, and that is hard. And so I think this also really relates to economic justice and economic equity issues in very, very real ways. I think, again, we can't like decouple the two, because that economic vulnerability is very real for so many people in our community.
Yeah, I mean, as Heather and Leslie, I think we've all said it at some point. There is a real integration between identity and this system of reporting sexual violence, and that can't be lost on us in any way. And I love that Heather started off with the reporting avenues, avenues to seek information about the process. At the college, I can tell you that we identified offices of personnel who service specific populations of individuals who are statistically shown to underreport. So our Center for Ideas, Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Social Change, and then also the LGBT Resource Center, right? Marginalized communities that are going to be more, or likely to be more vulnerable to this misconduct, but also to other, to more vulnerable in general. Giving them an avenue to seek more information about the process, to feel more empowered, is one method that we can take. And I love that Heather threw out a bunch of community resources, and maybe we need more.
Yeah, so I'm coming from where I don't know all the issues, but problem solving, I'll say, because this is real dicey. People can be at risk here if they report and they don't have multiple places to go to. But this might be a community project, I'll say, that maybe there's a place to report to where they're starting to track these issues at certain places. I'm problem solving. I don't know that this exists. But I would say good community project to help these people out, versus letting them hang there being vulnerable. And I like Heather's also recommendation to talk it through, because there's very real consequences.
Seems like, throughout this hour, several themes sort of have emerged, the importance of knowledge and sharing knowledge and information with people, education, that type of thing. The issue of attitudes, how to do self-examination as, in terms of, as persons who interact with others and their interactions with others, and being aware of what attitudes might convey certain aspects of harassment, but also, how to, as professionals involved, looking at one's own self-evaluation. But then there's the issue too that's been mentioned more than once about power. That harassment is sexualized power, as was said, earlier, and recognizing the nature of that power. But that power also, there's also the empowerment that we've seen in recent times in which people are speaking and addressing these issues. There have been high-profile instances of persons being held accountable, and all those dynamics kind of all a part of the larger piece of looking at this issue of sexual harassment and its implications. And so I am really appreciative of the way in which the three of you have, illuminated us and provided us some perspective and some handles on how to address this And I want to thank you so much for your participation in this program. I want to thank our audience as well, those who've joined us for this event. And we certainly look forward to seeing you for the Office of Human Rights next monthly event in April. And so we look forward to seeing you at that time. And again, we thank all of you for participating and for being part of today's event. Thank you. And